She left her groceries behind, then a stranger changed everything. She didn't mean to leave the groceries behind, but when she walked out of the store, head down and hands shaking, it was like the bags didn't even exist. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. It had been a long day, not loud or chaotic, just heavy. The kind of heavy that builds quietly over time without anyone noticing. Bills stacked on the counter, voicemails she hadn't returned, a house that felt too quiet no matter what room she was in. She had walked through the store like she was on autopilot. Milk, bread, coffee, a few canned things. Enough to get through the week. Nothing extra. She had stood in line, waited patiently, smiled when the cashier asked how her day was going. She even made a joke, though she didn't remember what it was. Just something to make it seem like she was fine. Inside, she wasn't. Inside, it felt like she was holding herself together with string, and the string was starting to fray. When the cashier handed her the receipt, she took it, nodded, and walked away. She didn't look back. Didn't notice the 2 paper bags still sitting at the end of the conveyor belt. Didn't realize what she'd done until she was standing next to her car, fumbling for her keys and staring at her empty hands. She stood there for a minute, trying to decide whether to go back. She could have. The store was only a short walk across the parking lot. But something about turning around felt impossible in that moment. Like if she had to take even one more step back into that store, everything she'd been holding in would come spilling out. So she didn't. She got in the car, closed the door, and sat there, hands still shaking, eyes staring straight ahead. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in a while. Not because she didn't want to, just because the tears never came anymore, like she had used them all up. After a few minutes, she started the car and drove home. The drive was short. 10 minutes, maybe less. The same streets, the same turns. She knew them by heart. The houses all looked the same. Lights on in the windows, cars in the driveways. It was the kind of neighborhood people called quiet and safe. She pulled into her own driveway and just sat there for a bit. No groceries in the back seat. Nothing to carry inside. Just her and the hum of the engine. She turned off the ignition, grabbed her purse, and went inside. The house was dim. She didn't bother turning on the lights right away, just set her bag down, kicked off her shoes, and sat at the edge of the couch. It wasn't about the groceries, not really. It was about what they represented. One more thing forgotten. One more small failure in a day that had already felt too full of them. She didn't even care about the money. It was the fact that she hadn't noticed. That she had been so disconnected from everything around her that walking out without them felt normal. She stayed there on the couch until the sun went down, the sky turning from gray to black behind the windows. She didn't turn on the TV, didn't look at her phone. Just sat there, hands in her lap, eyes on nothing. Outside, the world kept moving. Cars drove past, porch lights clicked on. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. But inside the house, nothing changed. And the groceries she'd bought to get through the week? They were still sitting in a bag at the store, and she was still sitting in the quiet, wondering how long she could keep pretending she was fine. The next morning came like it always did. Light through the blinds, the low hum of the heater kicking on, the same silence that filled every corner of the house. She got up, made coffee, and stood at the sink with the mug in her hands, staring out the window. The street was still. A neighbor across the road was scraping ice off his windshield. She recognized the rhythm of it. Scrape, pause, scrape again. She didn't think about the groceries right away. It wasn't until she reached for the bread to make toast and remembered the shelf was empty. No bread, no milk, no anything. Just a few leftovers in plastic containers and a jar of peanut butter that was nearly gone. That's when she remembered, clear as anything, walking out of the store with nothing in her hands. She set the mug down. Part of her wanted to drive back, to see if the bags were still there, if someone had set them aside, maybe even held them for her. But another part of her already knew the answer. Things like that didn't wait around, especially not overnight. She sat down at the kitchen table and opened her phone. There were messages. A couple from her sister, one from work, a few she didn't want to open. She scrolled past them, not reading any of it. Her stomach growled. She ignored it. Instead of going to the store again, she stayed home. She told herself it was fine, that she didn't really need anything right now, that she'd go later. But as the hours passed, she never left. By evening, the house felt smaller than it had in the morning. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. She put on music to fill the space, but turned it off after 10 minutes. It felt wrong, too cheerful for how she felt. She thought about the stranger in line behind her the day before, a man in a navy jacket, maybe in his late 30s. He'd had a small cart, just a few things, some fruit, a box of tea, a loaf of bread. She remembered because she'd glanced at his items without thinking, the way people do when they're trying not to make eye contact. She wondered if he'd noticed her leaving the bags behind. Probably not. People didn't pay attention like that. Still, the thought lingered. By the time the sun set again, the house was dark. She hadn't turned on any lights. Just let the dim evening settle in, one room at a time. She pulled a blanket over her shoulders and sat on the couch with her feet tucked under her. The silence didn't bother her anymore. It had become normal, predictable, something she could move through without tripping. Around 8, she heard footsteps outside. Not loud, just slow and steady up the front walk. She froze. Then a knock. 3 soft taps on the front door. She stayed still for a second, listening. Another knock. She stood up, slowly, her heart picking up pace. She didn't get many visitors. No one stopped by unannounced. When she opened the door, there he was. The man from the grocery store, navy jacket, same quiet expression. He was holding 2 paper grocery bags. "You left these," he said. His voice was calm, not too soft, not too loud. She didn't know what to say. She just stared at him, unsure what was happening. "I was behind you yesterday," he added. "Tried to catch you, but you were already gone. The store was going to toss them, so I offered to bring them by." She looked down at the bags. Bread, milk, coffee, the same items she had picked out. "You remembered?" she asked. He shrugged. "I figured if it were me, I'd want them back." She took the bags. Her hands were trembling just slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice quieter than she expected. He nodded. "No problem." And then, just like that, he turned and walked away. No questions. No expectations. Just a man returning something that didn't belong to him. She stood in the doorway for a while, groceries in hand, the cold air drifting into the house. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. She wasn't expecting the knock. Not that night. Not ever again, really. It had been 2 days since he brought the groceries. She hadn't seen him around town, not at the store, not on the sidewalk, not in passing. He had come and gone like a moment, quiet, brief, and kind. She had replayed the scene in her mind more times than she wanted to admit. The way he'd stood on her porch like he belonged there, but didn't assume it. The way he didn't make small talk or ask questions. He had just handed her what she left behind and walked away. And now, another knock. She hesitated before going to the door. It was already dark. She hadn't changed out of her sweatshirt. The lights in the living room were still off. But something about the sound pulled her up off the couch before she even thought about it. She opened the door slowly. It wasn't him. It was a delivery guy, holding a small package she didn't remember ordering. He handed it to her, said her name with a smile, then walked back to his car. She thanked him and closed the door. She set the package on the table but didn't open it right away. Instead, she found herself walking to the front window, peeking through the blinds like she might catch a glimpse of someone else out there. But the street was quiet. A few porch lights on. The same car parked across the road. Nothing unusual. She wasn't sure what she had been hoping to see. Later that night, she sat in bed with the lights off, staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet, except for the low hum of the fridge down the hall and the occasional creak of the floor settling. She thought about how strange it was that someone she didn't know had shown her more kindness in 2 minutes than most people had in months. No questions, no expectations, just someone paying attention. She kept thinking about how he'd said it. I figured if it were me, I'd want them back. It stuck with her, because the truth was, she hadn't expected to get anything back. Not the groceries, not the time, not the parts of herself she'd been slowly losing over the past year. She had stopped expecting people to notice, and most of the time, they didn't. But he did. The next afternoon, she went to the grocery store again. Not because she needed anything urgent, just because she wanted to be out. She walked slowly through the aisles, picking up a few small things: apples, eggs, cereal. She lingered by the coffee shelf longer than she needed to, half hoping she'd see him again. But he wasn't there. She paid, packed her bags, and this time made sure not to forget them. As she stepped outside, she glanced toward the parking lot. Nothing. She stood there for a moment, pretending to check her receipt, even though she already knew what it said. Then, just as she was turning to head to her car, she saw him. He was walking across the lot, alone, carrying one small bag in his hand. His jacket was the same. His pace was easy, not rushed, not distracted. He didn't see her, but she saw him, and for a second, she thought about calling out, saying thank you again, maybe starting a conversation. But she didn't. Not yet. She just watched as he got into his car, started the engine, and pulled away. Then she turned back toward her own car, her hands wrapped around the grocery bags, her steps a little steadier than before. He didn't need to know she saw him, but something about knowing he was real, that he was still out there, made the day feel a little less heavy. And for now, that was enough. The bag was still sitting on the kitchen counter. She hadn't unpacked everything. Some of the groceries had gone into the fridge, the milk and eggs mostly, but the rest sat untouched, still in the paper bag, like she didn't want to disturb the moment it had arrived. It wasn't about the food anymore. It was what it represented. Someone noticing. Someone showing up when she hadn't asked for anything. That part lingered. She stood at the counter the next morning, fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The bag was still there beside her. Bread, cereal, 2 cans of soup. Items she'd chosen without much thought, but now they looked different, like reminders of a kindness she wasn't used to. He hadn't left a note. He hadn't asked if she was okay. He hadn't stayed longer than a few seconds. But somehow, that was what made it matter more. He hadn't come to fix anything. He'd just come to return what was hers. And maybe, in a way, that's what she had needed most. She looked out the window, watching the early sunlight stretch across the sidewalk. The street was still, quiet, just the usual rhythm of a small town going through another quiet morning. Nothing out of place, nothing surprising, but she couldn't stop thinking about how that simple gesture had shifted something inside her. Later that afternoon, she went for a walk. Just around the block. It wasn't something she did often, but the air felt clearer than it had in days, and she didn't want to sit inside again. Not after everything that had happened. She passed by the grocery store. She didn't plan to go in, but she slowed as she approached, glancing through the front windows like she might see him again. He wasn't there. She kept walking. At the corner, she paused and looked at the sky. The clouds were thin, stretched like fabric across the blue. It felt like a good day to keep moving. When she got home, she finally unpacked the rest of the groceries. She moved slowly. Bread in the pantry, soup on the shelf, cereal in the cabinet. As she folded the paper bag and set it aside, she felt a strange mix of sadness and gratitude. It was just a bag of groceries, but it had reminded her what it felt like to be seen, and that feeling was harder to come by than she ever expected. The next few days passed quietly. She didn't see him again. Not at the store, not in the neighborhood, not anywhere. She tried not to read into it. People had lives, routines, places to be. He didn't owe her anything. Still, every time she stepped out the door, she found herself scanning the street, wondering. One evening, just before sunset, she took a seat on the front steps, coffee in hand again, warmer this time. She watched the sky turn a pale orange, the shadows stretch across the pavement. It was quiet, but not empty. The kind of quiet that felt less like loneliness and more like peace. She thought about the man, about how someone could walk into your life for a minute and still change something. Not because of what they said, but because of what they noticed. That night, as she turned out the lights and climbed into bed, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Not hope, exactly, not joy, just steadiness, like she wasn't sinking anymore. All because someone returned a bag she'd left behind, and did it without needing anything in return. She didn't know if she'd see him again, but if she did, she knew what she'd say. Not just thank you, but something simpler. I remember what you did. Because sometimes, the smallest act means more than anyone realizes. She saw him again on a Tuesday afternoon. It had been almost a week since he'd shown up at her door with the groceries, and she'd stopped expecting to see him at all. She had told herself it was a one-time thing, a kind moment from a stranger who had no reason to be anything more than that. But there he was, at the end of aisle 4, standing in front of the shelf with the coffee and tea. Same jacket, same quiet expression. He hadn't noticed her yet. He was reading the label on a box of tea, his cart nearly empty, just a few things inside. She froze for a second. Not out of fear, not out of nerves, just because she wasn't sure what to do. She didn't owe him anything. He didn't owe her anything. But something about seeing him again made the grocery store feel different. Not just another errand, not just another hour to get through. She stayed at the other end of the aisle, pretending to look at something she didn't need. She didn't want to interrupt him, but she watched, just for a moment, noticing how calm he looked, how present. He grabbed the tea, dropped it into his cart, and turned to go. Their eyes met for half a second as he passed. She gave a small smile. Nothing big, just enough to say, "I remember you." He returned it with a nod. No words, no pause, just quiet acknowledgement. That was it. She didn't see him again during the rest of her trip. She wandered through the store at her own pace, picked up what she needed, and took her time in the checkout line. But something about that moment stayed with her. It felt like the start of something, even if she didn't know what. The next day she saw him again. This time, not at the store. He was walking through the park just a few blocks from her house. No cart, no bags, just a slow walk along the path, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes on the ground ahead. She was in her car, pulling out of a parking spot nearby, and spotted him through the windshield. She didn't wave, she didn't roll down the window, but she stopped for a moment before driving off. He didn't look up, and still, she felt seen. After that, it became something she looked for. Not in a desperate way, just a quiet habit. At the grocery store, in the park, around town. Sometimes she saw him, sometimes she didn't. But when she did, it felt familiar now, comfortable, like passing someone you don't really know, but trust anyway. She started wondering about him, what his story was, where he came from, what made him notice her that day in the store, when everyone else had passed by without a glance. But she didn't ask, and he didn't offer. That was the thing about it. It didn't need to be more than it was. Two people, two lives, and something shared in the space between them. Not a romance, not a rescue, just recognition. One afternoon they passed each other again in the parking lot outside the store. She smiled and said, "Hey." He nodded and said, "Good to see you." Then they both kept walking. It didn't sound like much, but it was. Because in a world full of people who don't stop, don't look, don't ask, those small moments are everything. And now, she wasn't just the woman who left her groceries behind. She was someone who had been noticed, remembered, a part of something, even if it didn't have a name. And that was enough to keep her going. It was the cereal aisle where they finally talked. Not just a passing hello or a polite nod, a real conversation, quiet, simple, but real. She had gone to the store later than usual that day. The place was nearly empty. No lines, no rush. Just a slow hum of carts and overhead music no one really listened to. She wasn't in a hurry. She wandered the aisles, checking off a short list in her head. Bread, milk, oatmeal, things she could carry without much effort. When she turned into the cereal aisle, he was already there. He was standing near the far end, holding a box in his hand and studying it like he couldn't quite decide if it was the right one. His cart had only a few things in it, same as last time. A pattern, she noticed. He didn't buy much. Maybe he lived alone. Maybe he liked keeping things simple. She hesitated for a second, then started walking down the aisle. Slowly. Not with a plan, just moving forward. As she got closer, he looked up. They both paused. Then he said, "You again." His voice was calm, easy. She smiled, the kind that came without thinking. "Looks like we shop on the same schedule." He gave a small nod, holding the cereal box at his side now. "I've seen you a few times. Around." "I've seen you too," she said. "Mostly near the tea." He smiled at that. Creature of habit, I guess. They stood there for a moment, not quite awkward, but unsure of what came next. She glanced at the box in his hand. "That one's not bad. Kind of plain, though." "I'm trying to eat better," he said. "Doctor's orders." She looked at the label. "Well, it's got fiber." "Lucky me." They both laughed, just a little. It felt natural. "I never said thank you," she added, quieter now. He looked over at her. "You did. At the door." "I mean it, though. You didn't have to bring those groceries back." He shrugged. "It just seemed like the right thing to do." "That doesn't mean most people would have done it." He didn't argue. He just looked at her for a moment, then said, "You seemed like you were having a hard day." She didn't answer right away. Because he wasn't wrong. and because she wasn't used to people noticing. "Yeah," she said finally. "I was." He nodded. "We all have those sometimes." She looked at him then. Really looked. There were lines around his eyes, like someone who'd spent a lot of time squinting into sunlight or smiling at things he didn't talk much about. His coat had a small tear at the cuff. His hands were steady but looked tired. "I'm Sarah," she said. "Mark," he replied. They stood there, cereal boxes in hand, two strangers in a quiet aisle, and something about it felt okay. Normal. Not heavy, just easy. She reached for a different brand, tossed it in her cart. "This one's less like cardboard." "I'll take your word for it," he said. And then they moved on, finished their shopping, paid at separate registers. But as she stepped outside, groceries in hand, she spotted him by his car. He waited until she walked past, then said, "Have a good day, Sarah." She stopped, smiled. "You too, Mark." That was all. No invitation, no exchange of numbers, no big moment. Just two people who had shared a conversation in a place where most people never look up. She drove home that day without feeling the weight she usually carried. And when she put the cereal away, she smiled to herself. Because for the first time in a while, a small part of her day had felt light. And that was more than enough. He didn't know what she was carrying. When they stood there in the cereal aisle, when he handed her the box and made her laugh, when he said her name at the door as if it belonged, he had no idea. No idea about the nights she spent lying awake, trying to quiet the thoughts that came too fast. No idea about the way the house echoed now, like it was missing something that used to make it feel full. No idea about the stack of unopened mail on the kitchen table, the kind that wasn't urgent enough to force her hand, but heavy enough to make her look away. He didn't know about the quiet dinner table, about the second chair that never got pulled out anymore, about the coffee she brewed each morning, not because she needed it, but because it was something to do, something that used to be shared. He didn't know about the grief, the kind that doesn't announce itself anymore, the kind that just sits there, quiet in the background, like a shadow in the room that never leaves. And still, somehow his presence made it feel less heavy. Not because he said anything profound, not because he offered to help. He didn't. He didn't even ask questions. But there was something about the way he looked at her, steady, not in a rush, like she wasn't invisible. And that was more than she could say for most people. She saw him again 2 days later, just a glance across the store parking lot. He was walking toward his car, keys in hand. He looked up, saw her, and smiled. Not the kind of smile you save for someone special, just the kind that says, "I remember you." She smiled back. It was nothing, but it stayed with her. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal and thought about how strange it was to miss someone you didn't really know. Not in a romantic way. Not like a story playing out in her head. Just a presence. A kindness. The steady comfort of knowing that if she dropped something, literally or otherwise, there was someone out there who might notice. She didn't talk to many people these days. Not because she didn't want to, just because she didn't know what to say anymore. People asked how she was doing and expected simple answers. They didn't know what to do with anything more complicated. "Doing okay," she would say. "Getting through." They nodded, changed the subject, moved on. Mark didn't ask, and maybe that's why she felt safe. One afternoon, she walked into the store and saw him near the produce section. He was picking out apples, turning each one over in his hand like it mattered. She stood there for a second, watching before walking over. "Find a good one?" she asked. He looked up. "Not yet. They all look a little bruised." Maybe that's just how they are this week. Maybe. He handed her one without thinking. She took it, turned it over, and put it in her cart. They didn't talk much more after that. Just a few comments about the price of fruit and how the weather had turned, but when they parted, he said, "Take care, Sarah." And for some reason, that landed different. It wasn't just polite. It felt like he meant it. She nodded, didn't say anything back at first. But as he turned to leave, she called after him. "You too, Mark." She said it simply, but she meant it, because even though he didn't know what she was carrying, he had made space for her without even realizing it. And sometimes, that's all a person needs. Someone who doesn't try to fix the weight you carry. Just someone who doesn't look away. She hadn't invited anyone into her house in a long time. Not since everything changed. Not since the silence became the normal sound and the second chair at the table stopped being used. She kept the place clean enough. Dishes done, floors swept, mail gathered in a neat pile, even if she never opened most of it. But it wasn't a space she shared. Not anymore. That's why it surprised her when she heard herself say it. They had run into each other again at the store. It was early evening, right before the dinner rush. She had gone in for coffee filters. He was near the back, holding a rotisserie chicken like he wasn't quite sure if it was worth it. They talked for a minute, casual as always. Nothing deep. Just the kind of small conversation that slips easily between two people who've spoken enough times to skip the awkwardness. Then, without thinking, she said, "You want to come by for coffee?" He didn't react right away, just looked at her, a little surprised. "Right now?" he asked. "Yeah, if you've got time." He nodded. "I do." That was it. No hesitation, no questions. Just a quiet yes. They drove separately. Her car pulled into the driveway first. She sat for a moment before getting out. The house looked the same as always. Trim hedges, porch light just starting to glow as the sky faded into dusk. But tonight, it felt different. When he arrived, she opened the door before he could knock. "Come in," she said. He stepped inside and looked around. He didn't make any comments. Didn't say the place was nice. Didn't look at the framed pictures on the shelves or the stack of unopened mail. He just followed her into the kitchen and sat at the small wooden table while she poured 2 mugs of coffee. "Milk?" she asked. "No, this is good," he said. They sat across from each other, 2 mismatched mugs between them. The window above the sink reflected a soft, fading light. He took a sip and said, "You've got a quiet house." She nodded. "It used to feel full." He didn't press. Didn't ask what had changed. And maybe that's why she kept talking. "My husband passed 2 years ago," she said. Mark looked at her, steady and calm. Suddenly, heart failure. One day he was here and then he wasn't. She paused. Let the words settle. She didn't say them often. It was strange how fast everything got quiet. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look away. She went on. "I used to cook dinner every night. He'd sit right where you're sitting now, talk about his day, complain about the news, drink his coffee too late." Mark smiled gently at that. "After he was gone, I just stopped doing things. Left groceries behind, stopped inviting people over, didn't want to talk, didn't want to explain." He nodded slowly. "Makes sense." She looked at him. "You're the first person who's sat at this table since." He didn't say anything at first, just held his coffee between his hands and looked around the room as if he could feel what it had been before. "Thank you for letting me," he said. It was a simple response, but it felt right. They talked a little more after that. Nothing heavy, just light conversation about favorite foods and old recipes and how neither of them understood why cereal had gotten so expensive. The coffee got cold. The sky outside turned darker. Eventually, he stood up and reached for his coat. "Thanks for the coffee," he said. She walked him to the door. "Thanks for the groceries," she replied. He smiled. "I'll see you around?" "Yeah," she said. "You will." He stepped out onto the porch, and she watched him go. And for the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel so quiet. Not empty, just peaceful. She didn't expect the bag on the porch. It was a Saturday afternoon. The sky was gray but calm, the kind of weather that made people stay inside and slow down. She had spent most of the morning doing small things around the house, folding laundry, wiping down the counters, watering the plants she always forgot about. Nothing urgent, just enough to keep her moving. When she opened the front door to check the mail, she saw it. A single brown paper grocery bag, folded neatly at the top. No name, no note visible. Just sitting there like it had been placed with care, not dropped off in a hurry. She looked around. No car in the driveway, no footsteps on the sidewalk, just the bag and the quiet of the street. She bent down and picked it up. It was heavier than she expected. Inside were simple things: a loaf of bread, a small jar of honey, a box of tea, 2 apples, a can of soup. Nothing expensive, nothing flashy, but everything carefully chosen. Things that said comfort, warmth, thoughtfulness. At the bottom of the bag, folded between the items, was a small piece of paper. She unfolded it with care. There were only 6 words written in simple handwriting. "For when the days feel heavy." No name, no signature, but she didn't need one. She stood there for a moment, holding the note in one hand and the bag in the other. The quiet around her didn't feel cold. It felt full. She brought the bag inside, set it on the table, and sat down. She didn't unpack it right away. She just sat there, hands resting on the folded edge, the note beside her, and let herself breathe. Not cry, not fall apart, just feel. It had been a long time since someone had done something for her without asking for anything in return. No obligation, no expectation, just kindness, quiet and steady. And it wasn't about the groceries. It was about what they meant. Someone had seen her. Someone had remembered. She thought about the first time she left a bag behind, how she had walked out of the store with empty hands and a head full of noise, how she had sat in her car, unsure of what to do next, how she had convinced herself that no one noticed. But someone had, and that same someone had kept noticing. Not to fix her, not to rescue her, just to show her that she wasn't alone. Later that evening, she made tea from the box in the bag. Honey stirred in. Simple. Warm. She sat at the table, her hands wrapped around the mug, the folded note resting next to it. She didn't try to figure out what it all meant or what came next. She just let the moment be what it was. A gesture. A reminder. A weight. Shared. If only for a little while. And when she turned off the kitchen light and headed toward bed, she passed the front door and glanced outside one more time. The porch was empty now. The bag was inside. The note was tucked away. But something had changed. Something had softened. And she didn't feel forgotten anymore. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.